Hey, Soul and Riches Stories fam, we're stepping into another journey. Before we begin, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Drop your country flag so our Soul and Riches Stories family can see just how far our stories reach. Now, let's begin. The chandeliers glowed overhead, sending shards of light across glass and polished silverware. Every table in the grand dining hall was alive with chatter and laughter. Men in tailored suits raised glasses of wine. Women in gowns shimmered like they'd stepped straight from magazine covers. It was the kind of place where money didn't whisper, it roared. At one corner table, however, sat someone who didn't belong. Ella Bennett kept her hands clasped tightly around the strap of an old fabric bag, her knuckles stiff. The simple light blue dress she wore fit neatly but looked plain compared to the glitter of the room. She pressed her knees together under the table, trying to take up less space, trying to stay invisible. But she wasn't invisible. A cluster of so-called friends had positioned themselves just a few tables away. They kept glancing over, their smirks impossible to hide. Every time a waiter walked past Ella's empty table, every time another minute ticked by, the group leaned into each other and giggled. Her blind date was late, very late. She lifted her water glass, but her hand trembled and the ice rattled. A half hour had crawled by, and still the seat across from her remained empty. That's when she caught a sharp whisper carried just loud enough to sting. Maybe he saw her name and ran for the door. Can you blame him? She teaches preschool. Who wants that when you could have this? The group tilted their glasses toward each other, laughter bubbling over. They weren't even pretending to hide it anymore. Ella's chest tightened. She thought about standing, about leaving this gilded trap behind, but her legs felt fixed to the floor. A thin thread of hope still clung to her. Maybe he'd show. Maybe tonight wouldn't end as cruelly as it had begun. And then, it happened. The heavy restaurant doors opened with a quiet thud, and the air shifted. Conversations stalled, laughter caught in throats. A man stepped inside, tall, commanding, his suit cut sharp, his gaze sweeping the hall as though he owned it. Every eye followed him. And when his stride slowed, his attention locked on the one table no one expected, Ella Bennett's. A week earlier, the plan had sounded harmless enough. At least that's what they told her. Come on, Ella, you've been single forever. You deserve a chance at fun. You can't keep hiding in that little classroom forever. You need a real man. He's perfect for you. Handsome, rich, and trust me, he's going to sweep you off your feet. Their voices had been sweet, too sweet, each word wrapped in shiny ribbons of kindness, but Ella had lived long enough to know the difference between kindness and mockery. Still, it was hard to say no when the invitation came with so many smiles. The truth? Ella Bennett had lost track of how many times she'd dodged their offers. Blind dates, networking dinners, even casual brunches that somehow always left her embarrassed. She told herself this time would be different. That's what they promised. That's what she wanted to believe. But deep inside, a small voice whispered the question she didn't want to answer. Were they really friends? Or just spectators waiting for her to stumble again? It wasn't that Ella disliked herself. She loved her work. The children in her preschool class brought her joy in ways money couldn't measure. Sticky hands wrapped around her fingers, little voices shouting her name, the look of wonder when a child read their first word. That was her treasure. But treasure like that didn't shine in places like the restaurant she now sat in. Her salary barely stretched from month to month. Her car coughed smoke on cold mornings. The dress she wore tonight wasn't new. It was the same light blue one she wore to parent-teacher conferences. And that fabric bag clutched in her lap, a gift from her late mother, patched and repatched until the seams whispered of all the years it had survived. Meanwhile, her so-called friends glittered in rented gowns and designer shoes. They made sure to remind Ella of her differences without ever saying it outright. Oh, you'll be fine, Ella. Men like a woman who's simple. It makes them feel powerful. Don't worry if he doesn't stay long, at least you'll get a free meal out of it. They laughed when they said it, tossing their hair, brushing it off as harmless jokes. But Ella felt the sting behind the sugar. They weren't building her up. They were setting her on a stage, because here was the unspoken truth. Ella wasn't invited for love, she was invited for entertainment, and still she said yes. Why? Because loneliness has a way of softening defenses. Because the idea that maybe, just maybe, Someone out there might look past her ordinary life was too tempting to ignore. She wanted to believe she was worthy of being chosen, not just tolerated. On the day of the date, she ironed her dress 3 times until the creases gave up. She brushed her hair until it shone and clipped in the small pearl pin she saved for special occasions. Sure, this was as special as it got. But as she walked into that glittering restaurant, her confidence wavered. The chandeliers looked like they cost more than her entire apartment. The wine list had names she couldn't pronounce, and her friends, already gathered, whispering, hiding laughter behind manicured hands. "Trust us, Ella. Tonight will be unforgettable." Those words echoed in her ears as she took her lonely seat. Not unforgettable because of romance. Not unforgettable because of kindness. Unforgettable because humiliation was the goal all along. They hadn't invited her to find love. They had invited her to be the punchline. Adrian Cole hadn't come to the restaurant to find love. His schedule was already crowded, board meetings stacked back to back, contracts waiting for his signature, numbers flashing across digital screens late into the night. Tonight was supposed to be nothing more than a short dinner with a potential client, a polite conversation before returning to the real work that ran his empire. To the rest of the world, Adrian Cole was a name spoken with admiration or envy. CEO of Cole Enterprises, single father raising a daughter alone, a man who'd built an empire from determination and discipline. Inside these circles of crystal and velvet, he was more myth than man. But when he walked through the polished doors of the restaurant, he wasn't thinking of his reputation. He was focused on efficiency, finish dinner, return to work, and get home in time to kiss his daughter goodnight. And then his gaze stopped. Across the room, at a corner table, he noticed something that disrupted the rhythm of his stride. A woman, sitting alone, shoulders tense, hands wrapped around a water glass as though it were the only anchor she had. Her dress was simple, her bag even simpler, but none of that explained why he couldn't look away. It was the laughter, not hers, but the cruel, cutting laughter from the nearby table where a group of young people leaned too close together, eyes darting toward her like knives disguised as glances. They laughed not with her, but at her. Their amusement was sharp, pointed, deliberate. Adrian had seen this before. Different settings, same cruelty. In boardrooms, it came in the form of whispers about a competitor's downfall. Among investors, it appeared in smug satisfaction when someone's losses grew. But here, in this glittering restaurant, it was uglier, because the target wasn't a corporation or a rival. It was one woman who looked like she'd already had to fight just to walk through those doors. He paused, watching. The woman lifted her head for a moment. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips pressed tightly together, but her eyes, they carried something else. Shame, yes. Hurt, certainly. But beneath it was a fragile thread of resolve. She wasn't laughing along, wasn't shrinking into invisibility. She sat upright, trembling but unbroken, refusing to crumble under the weight of their scorn. And that, more than her dress, more than her trembling hands, was what caught Adrian's attention. His jaw tightened. He despised cruelty masked as entertainment. He despised power used only to humiliate the powerless. And here, in this hall of chandeliers and polished wood, cruelty was being served on silver platters. His instinct told him to intervene. Not because he knew her, not because there was anything to gain, but because dignity, fragile as glass, was being chipped away by people who thought it was their right to laugh. Adrian shifted his weight, debating. His client would arrive soon, and the last thing he needed was distraction. But his eyes returned to her again and again, drawn to the quiet defiance in her posture. She reminded him of something he told his daughter often. Strength isn't about never trembling, it's about standing tall even when you do. And right now, this stranger, this woman sitting in a simple blue dress with a fabric bag on her lap, was showing a strength her tormentors couldn't recognize. The laughter swelled again. He saw her shoulders stiffen, her hands tighten around the glass until the water inside trembled. His chest grew heavy. This wasn't his business. He knew that. But every part of him rebelled against turning away. Because in that moment, Adrian Cole, the man who commanded boardrooms and dictated billion-dollar deals, saw something that demanded his attention. Not the polished clients, not the wine lists, not the contracts waiting on his desk. The woman sitting alone, trying not to break, while a chorus of cruelty surrounded her. And for the first time that evening, Adrian knew his night wasn't going to go according to plan. Adrian Cole had made up his mind. In a life built on strategy and careful moves, this decision came with no calculation, only instinct. His stride was steady, each step echoing against the polished floor. Conversations faltered. Cutlery paused in midair, heads turned as the tall figure in the tailored suit moved with absolute certainty through the hall of crystal chandeliers. No hesitation, no glance to the left or right, only one destination. The corner table. Ella's table. The group of so-called friends froze, their laughter strangled mid-breath. Their eyes darted between each other, then back to him, wide with disbelief. One of them let out a nervous chuckle as though still waiting for the punchline, but Adrian's expression was unreadable. His gaze locked firmly on the woman who sat clutching her bag like a lifeline. Ella's eyes widened. For a split second, she thought he must be walking past, heading for someone far more fitting for a man of his stature. But when his shadow fell across her table, her breath caught. He didn't look away. He stopped right in front of her. And then, without asking, without faltering, he reached for her hand. The warmth of his palm enveloped her trembling fingers. She startled, glancing up at the stranger towering above her. His grip was firm, grounding, as if telling the entire room he had arrived not by chance, but with purpose. "Sorry I'm late," Adrian's deep voice carried across the silence. "I'm the one you're meeting tonight." Every sound in the restaurant seemed to vanish at once. Glasses stilled, forks hovered. The friends at the other table gaped, mouths slack, their whispers caught in their throats. The man who had just declared himself her date wasn't some ordinary suitor. They recognized him instantly. Adrian Cole, the billionaire CEO whose name filled headlines, whose face graced magazine covers. The very last man they expected to claim Ella Bennett. Ella's chest tightened, her pulse racing so hard she was sure he could feel it through her hand. Confusion swirled. Who was this man? Why was he here, and why was he pretending? Her lips parted, the start of a protest trembling at the edge of her voice. But when she met his eyes, the words dissolved. There was no mockery in them, no amusement, just a steady, resolute calm, as though he had drawn a line across the room and placed himself squarely at her side. Her so-called friends fidgeted. One coughed, another lowered her gaze, suddenly fascinated by the rim of her glass. The cruel delight that had colored their faces drained into something else: shock, unease, even envy. Adrian turned his head toward them, his expression still unreadable, but his tone carrying a weight that silenced even the boldest among them. "Is there a problem?" The words were simple, but they landed like a challenge. No one answered, not one dared. Ella's heart pounded. She wanted to pull her hand back, to tell him she wasn't part of whatever this was, but at the same time, a flicker of something else sparked inside her. Relief. For the first time all evening, she wasn't sitting there as prey. She wasn't the joke. For once, the power in the room had shifted, and it rested beside her. Adrian calmly pulled out the chair across from her and sat down as if the seat had always been his. His presence filled the space, his confidence wrapping around her like an invisible shield. Waiters hurried forward, menus in hand, suddenly attentive to a table they had overlooked only moments ago. Ella swallowed hard, still lost in confusion. She had no idea why this man had stepped in, or what it meant for her. But as she glanced at her stunned friends, something unfamiliar stirred in her chest. Pride. The narrator's voice lingers. Sometimes, dignity borrows a stronger hand to stand taller. And that night, in the middle of a cruel joke, Ella Bennett found hers. The waiter appeared almost instantly, his posture straighter, his tone suddenly respectful. Adrian didn't even glance at the menu. "Bring us the house's signature appetizer," he said, his voice calm but certain, "and a bottle of the Chateau Blanc, chilled. For us." That last word, us, hung in the air like a declaration. He didn't just order for himself. He placed Ella in the same category at his side, no longer separate. Her friends shifted uncomfortably. Their little performance, their laughter, their whispered plans of watching her wilt had crumbled. Now they sat stiff-backed, staring into their glasses as though the stemware might hide their envy. Ella tried to protest, her lips parting in quiet panic. I can't drink that wine. It must be too." Adrian leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "Don't worry about the price. Tonight, you're not their joke. Tonight, you're my guest." The words sent warmth rushing to her cheeks. She didn't know this man, not really. Yet the steadiness of his tone, the quiet conviction, made it hard to look away. As the waiter poured the wine, Adrian shifted the conversation toward her. "So, Ella," he began, as though her name were one he'd known for years, "tell me about what you do." Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her napkin. "I teach preschool," she admitted, almost apologetically. But Adrian didn't smile in pity. He didn't brush it aside as small or unimpressive. Instead, his eyes softened. "That means you shape the very first years of a child's life. That's no small thing." Ella blinked, surprised. People rarely said it like that. To most, she was just a woman who wrangled crayons and storybooks. But he said it as though she were carrying something noble. The words unlocked something in her. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased. She began to tell him small stories, about the boy who tried to color a rainbow without using red, about the girl who refused to nap unless she held a plastic tiara in her hand. As she spoke, Adrian listened with real interest, his dark eyes fixed on her. He laughed at the right moments, not forced, not polite, but genuine. Ella found herself laughing too. At first it was tentative, unsure, then freer, brighter, until the sound carried across the table. And for the first time that night, her laughter didn't feel like a shield, it felt like joy. Her friends heard it. Their expressions tightened. The smug confidence they had worn earlier now curdled into frustration. They whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the pair across the room. What had been planned as humiliation was unraveling before their eyes. Adrian noticed, though he didn't address them. His focus never left Ella. He admired the way her face lit up when she forgot to be self-conscious. He admired the honesty in her stories, the sincerity that poured out without calculation. In his world, conversations often sounded rehearsed. Compliments came with hidden motives. Laughter was timed like strategy. But here was a woman speaking about juice boxes and paper crowns as though they mattered more than money, and somehow, in her voice, they did. Ella lowered her gaze, embarrassed by how much she had shared. "I'm sorry, I must sound silly to someone like you." Adrian shook his head, firm. "No, you sound real, and that's worth more than anything else in this room." The words struck her deeper than he realized. Real. Worth more. They weren't words she heard often. Not from friends, not from anyone. The appetizers arrived, delicate arrangements on porcelain plates. Adrian gestured for her to taste first. She hesitated, then smiled faintly as the flavors surprised her. He watched her reaction with a subtle satisfaction, as though her delight mattered more than the dish itself. By the time the entrees came, the tension that had gripped Ella at the start of the night had loosened. The trembling had quieted. The humiliation that once burned inside her was cooling into something steadier. Dignity. For the first time that night, Ella wasn't sitting in a spotlight of ridicule. She was sharing a table, sharing laughter, with a man who treated her as though she belonged there. And across the room, her friends simmered in silence, powerless to undo what had just begun. The evening ended not with laughter, but with a heaviness Ella couldn't name. Adrian rose first, his movements calm, confident, as if the entire night had unfolded according to his plan. He extended his hand, steady and commanding, and though every part of her wanted to resist, Ella placed hers in his and allowed him to lead her past her silent friends. Their mocking smiles were gone, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. The heavy restaurant doors closed behind them, cutting off the glittering lights and murmured whispers. Outside, the air was cooler, fresher, but Ella's chest tightened instead of easing. She stopped abruptly at the edge of the sidewalk, yanking her hand from his grasp. "What was that?" Her voice trembled, sharper than she intended. "What did you just do in there?" Adrian turned, unhurried. Under the glow of the street lamp, his expression remained unreadable, firm, calm, as though nothing about the evening unsettled him. "I stopped them from humiliating you," he said simply. "Humiliating me?" Ella gave a brittle laugh, shaking her head. "You sat down, pretended to be my date, and made everyone in that room believe I was with you. Do you have any idea what that means? What they'll say tomorrow?" "They would have said worse if I hadn't," Adrian replied, his tone still level. Ella folded her arms across her chest, holding herself as though bracing against a storm. "You don't get it. You can walk into any room and own it. Me? I don't have that kind of power. Tomorrow those whispers will follow me everywhere. I'll be the woman who had to be rescued by a stranger." Adrian stepped closer, his gaze steady, cutting through the fragile shield of her anger. "Is that really worse than being their joke?" His words struck too close. She flinched, her silence giving away what her pride refused to admit. You sat there for half an hour while they laughed at you. He continued, his voice firmer now, though never raised. You didn't speak. You didn't fight back. You think that's protecting yourself? Ella's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth pressed hard. She had sat there, silent, waiting, hoping the night would end differently without daring to change it herself. Silence isn't protection, Ella, Adrian said softly. It's surrender, and you don't deserve to surrender to people like that. Her eyes burned, tears threatening, though she blinked them back furiously. You don't even know me, she whispered. Why would you care? For the first time his composure shifted. A flicker of something raw broke through his calm exterior. Because I can't stand cruelty, he admitted. I've seen too much of it, people tearing down others just to feel taller. I won't stand by and watch it happen again. Not to anyone. Ella's lips parted, but no words came. His confession carried no arrogance, no demand, just conviction. Still, her pride pushed back. I didn't need saving. Maybe not, Adrian allowed. But everyone needs someone to stand beside them now and then. The quiet between them deepened. A car passed, its headlights stretching shadows across the pavement. Ella looked away, clutching her bag tightly against her chest. Thank you, she said at last, her voice fragile, reluctant. But this can't happen again. Whatever you thought you were doing, whatever story they all believe now, it isn't real. Adrian studied her for a moment, his jaw tightening as though he wanted to argue. But then he gave a faint nod, stepping back. If that's what you want. He turned, his tall figure retreating into the night, leaving her standing at the curb. Ella exhaled shakily, pressing her palm against her racing heart. Relief, anger, gratitude, they tangled so tightly she couldn't separate one from the other. She told herself she'd never see him again. But the strange pull in her chest whispered otherwise. Morning light spilled across the cheerful classroom, washing away the weight of last night's embarrassment. Ella moved through the familiar space of Maple Leaf Preschool, adjusting the little chairs, straightening finger paint drawings pinned on the wall. The scent of crayons and glue filled the air, grounding her. Here, among paper crowns and storybooks, she belonged. She repeated the words in her mind like a mantra. Last night doesn't matter, last night is over. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. The principal stepped in holding a folder. Ella, we've got a new enrollment. A girl joining us today. Bright, polite, a little shy. I'd like you to help her feel at home. Of course, Ella replied, smoothing the ribbon in her hair. She always tried to make the new ones feel safe. Moments later, the door opened wider, and in walked a woman in her 50s with a warm, professional air. Beside her, clinging nervously to her hand, was a little girl no older than 5. She had straight brown hair cut in bangs, a tiny pink backpack with glittering wings stitched on. Her eyes were wide, cautious but curious. Ella crouched down so she was level with the child. Hello there. I'm Miss Bennett. Do you want to sit near the window or in the reading corner today? The girl studied her intently. Then, with a sudden smile that softened her whole face, she asked in a small, secretive voice, Are you the princess teacher? Ella blinked, startled, then laughed gently. Princess teacher. What makes you think that? The child pointed at the simple pearl hairpin clipped into Ella's hair. You have a little crown, and Daddy says kind people are princesses. Her chest tightened at the innocence of it. She reached out her hand. Then does our little princess want to hold the princess teacher's hand for a tour of the classroom? The girl nodded eagerly, slipping her small hand into Ella's. Within an hour, Ella had introduced her to the art corner, the block station, and the reading rug. The girl had even named a floppy-eared stuffed bunny Marshmallow and insisted everyone call it that. By snack time, she was giggling with the other children, though she kept drifting back to Ella's side. As though tethered to her warmth, the connection was instant, effortless, so natural that Ella almost forgot to ask, What's your name, sweetheart? The girl looked up from her juice box. Sophie Cole. The name struck like a jolt. Ella froze, her smile faltering. Cole. Her mind raced back to last night, the man in the gray suit, the steady hand claiming hers, the calm voice cutting through cruelty. Adrian Cole. Her heart stumbled. This child was his daughter. Before she could gather her thoughts, the classroom door opened again. The sound of firm footsteps carried across the linoleum. Ella turned. Adrian Cole stood framed in the doorway, tall in a crisp shirt, his presence commanding even in this room of tiny chairs and finger paint stains. He paused when his eyes met hers. For a moment, neither moved. The softness in his gaze was different from last night's shield of steel. Dear, he wasn't the billionaire CEO silencing laughter. He was a father checking on his child. Daddy, Sophie squealed, dashing across the room and clutching his leg. He bent down, lifting her easily into his arms. The lines of power in his face eased as he kissed her forehead. How's my princess? She's my princess teacher, Sophie announced proudly, pointing toward Ella. Adrian's gaze returned to Ella. This time, his expression carried something almost unreadable. Surprise, recognition, and something quieter, softer. Ella's pulse quickened. Of all the children, of all the schools, fate had brought his daughter to her classroom. Her instinct screamed to step back, to build distance before the lines blurred further. But Sophie tugged her hand and Adrian's together, giggling. In that tiny gesture, something shifted. It no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them could ignore. Days at Maple Leaf Preschool moved quickly. Yet Ella found herself pausing whenever Sophie Cole entered the room. The child had a way of clinging to her side, as though Ella's presence was the safest place she knew. It wasn't unusual for new students to need extra attention. But this was different. Sophie sought her out not only for comfort, but for companionship. One morning, as the class gathered in a circle, Sophie scooted closer until she was nearly sitting in Ella's lap. Her small voice whispered, "Can I sit by you every day?" Ella smiled softly, brushing a curl of hair from Sophie's forehead. "As long as you like. But you know you're brave enough to sit anywhere." Sophie shook her head firmly. "You're kind. It feels better here." The words lodged in Ella's chest. Kind. So simple, yet spoken with the honesty only a child carried. Later, during art time, Sophie tugged on Ella's sleeve. "Can I draw my family?" Ella crouched beside her, watching as Sophie carefully sketched a tall figure, her father. Beside him, she drew herself, with wings on her backpack, just like the ones she carried. Then her little hand hesitated. She drew another figure, faint, almost erased. "Who's that?" Ella asked gently. Sophie's crayon paused. "That was Mommy. She's not here anymore." Ella's breath caught. The innocence of the admission struck deep, her heart tightening with sympathy. She placed a steady hand on Sophie's back. "Do you miss her?" Sophie nodded, her lips pressing together. "Daddy says she's in heaven. He says she can see me when I smile." Ella blinked back the sting in her eyes. She didn't want to make the girl sadder, so she leaned closer and whispered, "Then we'll make sure you smile a lot, so she sees you every day." Sophie grinned, the sadness already lifting under the promise. Across the room, Adrian Cole stood quietly in the doorway, having arrived earlier than usual for pickup. He hadn't announced himself. Instead, he watched. His gaze softened at the sight of his daughter smiling again, her small shoulders unburdened for once. And it wasn't just the smile. It was who had given it to her. Ella. She wasn't putting on a performance. She wasn't dazzled by money or status. He could see that in her modest dress, in her focus entirely on Sophie. She treated his daughter with gentleness, with patience, with the kind of sincerity Adrian rarely saw in adults, let alone in the circles of polished society he was forced to navigate. When class ended, Sophie ran to her father, clutching his hand while tugging Ella's sleeve at the same time. "Daddy, this is my princess teacher. She makes the monsters in my head go away." Adrian's chest tightened. He glanced at Ella, who looked flustered by the praise, as though she didn't deserve it. But he knew what he saw. His daughter, who often carried shadows in her eyes, was glowing. "Thank you," Adrian said simply, his voice lower than usual. Ella waved it off quickly. "She's a wonderful girl. Any teacher would say the same." "No," Adrian countered, his gaze steady. "Not any teacher. Not like that." The weight of his words lingered between them. Ella shifted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, uncomfortable under the intensity. She wasn't used to being noticed, especially not by a man like him, because that was the truth she couldn't shake. He belonged to a world of contracts, tailored suits, and wealth measured in numbers she couldn't even imagine. She belonged to a classroom with finger paint stains and paper crowns. Even as Sophie wrapped her arms around her waist, Ella felt the wall rising again inside her. No matter how kind Adrian seemed, no matter how soft his voice turned when he spoke about his daughter, she reminded herself not to step too close. For Ella Bennett had learned long ago, kindness could turn to cruelty in an instant, and men with power lived in a world far too different from her own. Still, as she watched Adrian lift Sophie into his arms, Their daughter-father bond undeniable. A quiet thought flickered in her chest. Uninvited. What if this was different? The change didn't take long to spark whispers. By the end of the week, Ella noticed the stares. At the grocery store, in the staff lounge at school, even on her own street. People who had once overlooked her now leaned together, speaking just loud enough for her to catch fragments. She's spending time with Adrian Cole, isn't she? Imagine, our Ella, of all people. She probably sees dollar signs. Please, a billionaire doesn't notice a preschool teacher unless she's after something. The words cut, not because she believed them, but because she knew how quickly gossip spread. In a city where Cole Enterprises touched every corner, Adrian's name was too big to escape, and now somehow her name had been dragged beside his. Her so-called friends didn't help. They fueled the fire with smug smiles. "Oh, Ella," one of them said in the teacher's lounge, "I heard you've upgraded from crayons to contracts. Good for you. Maybe you'll finally get that new car." Laughter followed, sharp and deliberate. Ella forced a smile, retreating into silence, but inside, shame pooled heavy in her chest. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't planned for Sophie to walk into her classroom, or for Adrian to stand at her side. Yet here she was, painted as a woman chasing wealth she didn't even want. One afternoon, as the children napped, Ella stood by the window, staring at the playground outside. Her reflection in the glass looked smaller somehow, like the voices of others had shrunk her. What if they were right? Not about her motives, but about the cost? Adrian Cole had built his empire on discipline and reputation. Could she ruin that just by being near him? That evening, Adrian arrived to pick up Sophie. His presence, as always, filled the hallway. Crisp shirt, steady stride, the kind of authority that made people straighten their backs without realizing. Ella greeted him with polite warmth, but her eyes avoided his. "Ella," he said quietly, catching the change. "What's wrong?" She shook her head quickly. "Nothing. Sophie's been wonderful today. She's adjusting beautifully." But Adrian wasn't a man who accepted surface answers. He waited, his gaze steady until her composure cracked. "They're talking," whispered, voice breaking. "People are saying I'm using you, that I'm after your money. I can't stop them, and I can't bear the thought of hurting your reputation." Her throat tightened, tears threatening as she looked down at her hands. "You've worked too hard to be dragged down by gossip about some nobody teacher who doesn't belong in your world." Adrian stepped closer, his voice lower, firmer. "Look at me, Ella." Reluctantly, she lifted her eyes. "The only opinion that matters is Sophie's and mine," he said, each word deliberate. "Do you understand? Let them talk. Let them whisper. They don't know you. They don't see what I see." Her breath caught. "And what do you see?" Adrian's gaze softened, the edges of his steel melting just slightly. "I see a woman who gave my daughter back her smile. A woman who stands taller even when the world tries to shrink her. That's worth more than all the contracts I've ever signed." The sincerity in his voice unraveled her defenses. Tears slipped free, not from weakness, but from the release of carrying too much alone. She pressed a hand to her face, embarrassed, but Adrian didn't look away. Instead, he reached for her hand again. Not in the bold, commanding way he had that night at the restaurant, but with quiet reassurance, a gesture that said, "You are safe here." For the first time, Ella allowed herself to believe it. The whispers might not stop. The world might always judge. But in that moment, under Adrian Cole's steady gaze, she realized something she had forgotten. She was not alone. The invitation came on heavy ivory cardstock, its gold lettering almost intimidating. Ella held it in trembling hands, staring at the words, "Cole Enterprises Annual Charity Gala." Adrian had extended the invitation himself, his voice calm, leaving her no polite way to refuse. Still, every nerve in her body resisted. The last time she had walked into a room of glitter and wealth, it had nearly destroyed her. She had no gown, no jewels, no designer shoes to hide behind. But Adrian's steady reassurance lingered in her memory. The only opinion that matters is Sophie's and mine. And so, when the evening arrived, Ella found herself walking into a ballroom more dazzling than anything she had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers scattered light like falling stars. Tables draped in silk overflowed with flowers. The air hummed with voices of the powerful, executives, politicians, families whose fortunes could buy entire neighborhoods. Her steps faltered at the entrance. She could feel the eyes, the quiet appraisals. She doesn't belong here. She imagined the whispers before they even formed. But then Adrian appeared at her side, his presence steady as stone. "You look perfect," he said simply, offering his arm. Her modest navy dress suddenly felt less small. She took his arm, and together they entered. Throughout the evening, Adrian remained attentive, not as a CEO escorting a guest, but as a man quietly protective of someone he valued. He introduced her not as a friend or a teacher, but with deliberate weight. "This is Ella Bennett." No apologies, no qualifiers. And though some faces flickered with curiosity, others with judgment, Adrian never wavered. He guided conversations back to her when she fell silent, drawing her out gently until her laughter returned, surprising even herself. Then, as the dinner plates were cleared and the orchestra softened, Adrian rose. The room quieted instantly. This was the moment every guest anticipated, the speech from Adrian Cole, the man whose name carried both power and influence. He didn't begin with numbers or achievements. Instead, his gaze drifted toward Sophie, who sat beaming in her little gown, and then toward Ella. "This past year," he began, his voice resonant yet warm, "I've been reminded of something we often forget in business, in wealth, in the chase for success. That joy, real joy, is not measured in profits. It's measured in smiles, in the light someone can bring to a child's eyes." Whispers stirred across the tables. Guests leaned forward. Adrian continued, his eyes never leaving Ella. "My daughter found that light again because of someone in this room. Someone who had no reason to give so much of herself, but did. Not for recognition, not for gain, but because kindness is who she is." Ella's breath caught. She wanted to shrink into her chair, yet the sincerity in his voice held her in place. "Ella Bennett," Adrian said clearly, "you've given Sophie back her laughter. And in doing so, you've given me more than I can ever repay." A hush fell. Then Adrian stepped forward, each stride deliberate. He stopped in front of her table, and before she could react, he lowered to one knee. Gasps rippled through the room. Ella froze, her eyes wide, her hands trembling against the tablecloth. This wasn't a show. His gaze was steady, stripped of performance, filled only with truth. "I don't care about the whispers," he said, his voice soft but carrying across the hall. "I don't care about the divisions between my world and yours. All I care about is Sophie's smile, and the woman who made it possible." He reached for her hand, his warmth steadying her trembling fingers. "Ella Bennett, will you marry me?" Tears blurred her vision. She heard the murmurs around her, the disbelief, the envy, the shock, but they no longer mattered. In Adrian's eyes, for the first time in her life, she saw herself reflected as worthy. Her voice broke, yet carried strong enough for the room to hear. "Yes." The orchestra swelled. Sophie clapped her small hands, shouting, "Princess Teacher said yes!" And for Ella, humiliation had transformed into honor, doubt into certainty. In the very space where she once felt invisible, she now stood claimed, not as a joke, but as the woman chosen by Adrian Cole. From the beginning, Ella's night was meant to be a cruel spectacle. She walked into that restaurant trembling, a target for laughter, convinced she didn't belong. Yet what started as humiliation transformed into something she never could have imagined: respect, dignity, and ultimately, love. Those who mocked her saw a woman to be ridiculed. Adrian Cole saw a woman worth standing beside. The same friends who set the trap sat speechless as the joke turned into a declaration, and the whispers of doubt only strengthened the bond that followed. It wasn't the chandeliers, the wine, or the glittering gowns that defined her worth. It was the quiet courage she carried, even when she trembled. And when Adrian knelt before her at the gala, it wasn't wealth that mattered. It was the sincerity of a man who had finally found the woman capable of giving his daughter back her smile. Sometimes, the cruelest setups create the most unexpected beginnings. True love isn't found in glittering gowns or grand wealth. It's found when dignity meets courage. What would you have done if you were in Ella's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share your country flag, and don't forget to subscribe to Souls and Riches Stories channel, where dignity always wins.